So, this podcast was going to be a book. It was almost my second book. And so that's kind of the motivation behind it. I don't remember exactly when it kind of shifted into being the idea of a podcast. But so my first book, self-published, finished in 2013. And it basically, that book tracked history of kind of my personal philosophical journey. Mm-hmm. And which went from kind of the beliefs that I was raised with and my curiosity of delving into reading about philosophy, starting with Western philosophy and apologetics, really, and then getting into Eastern philosophy, what's called integrative thought, which is a field trying to integrate Western psychology and Eastern thought. Then getting into, I think after that was more when I started getting into something called consciousness studies.
I remember having some conversations
about consciousness stuff. Yeah. And I'm still fascinated by consciousness studies. I find consciousness to be really still one of the most wonder-inducing mysteries. And when you read consciousness studies stuff, you have to kind of get into science. You have to dip your toes into that world because you have to read about the brain and about body chemistry and things like that.
Deep enough to know that you do, that we're like, that's still the hardest problem.
Yeah.
That we basically have no idea about.
Yeah, for sure.
But you need to rule that out, you know?
Yeah. Well, even to understand what's being said, you have to read some science stuff. Mm-hmm. And then that kind of led me into reading more philosophy of science, reading about epistemology and the scientific method and kind of what counts for scientific knowledge. What do we mean?
It's interesting how our interests drive our education. Mm-hmm. I've had that a lot as well because like the terminology thing, you do have to have a base depending on what you're looking at. And I've spent a lot of time looking up words, asking Siri, what does this $5 word mean?
Sure. Yeah.
But it's, a lot of times I find them,
because trying to learn that outside of the context of if you weren't interested in the subject.
Going into I'm just going to go read the dictionary today so I can gain knowledge.
Yeah. True.
Hard motivation.
Yeah. Yeah, so that path for me kind of ended, end is not exactly the right word, which is what I'm getting to. But by the time that I had kind of finished up that book, I had become comfortable with the fact that I rejected a number of ideas that I had been raised with, all right? Kind of, and those ideas gathering around what could be called theistic descriptions of the world. And so to where I rejected some of those key assertions and descriptions of the world. And so that kind of led me into the atheistic circles. And I already, by the time I finished the book up, was having some thoughts beyond that. And had some other things that I was interested in looking at. And I wasn't real interested even in marketing the book. It was really more of a process that I went through to kind of get my thoughts out onto to paper, so to speak, even though I didn't put it in print. It's an e-book. And
it's about as print gets.
Yeah. But the social circles that kind of put me in, that I spent some time in, I actually found to be really negative. I had a really negative, it left a negative taste in my mouth. And so that kind of got me to thinking, if I don't like this social world, but I disagree with maybe some of the people in this social world over here, then one of the questions that I began to think about is like, so what are my kind of people? What kind of people do I enjoy being around? And the somewhat humorous, to me at least, heuristic that I came up with is what I started calling the get a brew heuristic, right? The get a brew heuristic. And what I meant by that is simply, would I like to get a brew with this person? All right. Would I enjoy getting a coffee, getting a beer with this person, regardless of, so in other words, the most interesting thing about you is not,
not the facts.
Yeah, the actual things you believe or think.
Isn't that interesting that flashes out so much about what we think about, like, the time we might want to spend with somebody or not can be fleshed out very well by getting a beer or a coffee, or where there is some downtime of some sort that is not highly focused on talking about a particular thing, because I think you can quickly flesh out who you're gonna be able to or be interested in talking.
Yeah, I think that's where the old social convention of breaking bread together comes from.
Absolutely, absolutely. I haven't thought about that. But
you bond with people and over food or drink.
Right.
But yeah, that was so. That kind of got me to thinking. What sorts of ideas, what kinds of conversations do I want to have with people? If the most interesting conversations. It's not that we can't have we can't have interesting conversations about those beliefs or ideas, but what kinds of headings do these value conversations fall under? What shared values do we have? What kind of meaning structures are we pursuing in common? And having interesting conversations has more to do with us sharing the things that we have in common than us trying to find things to fight about and be nasty to one another about. Because that was one of the big things that turned me off in the atheist community, was a lot of behavior by some of the subgroups that kind of took over that little circle. There was just a lot of behavior towards outgroups. In other words, people that didn't think the same way as them on certain ideas. There was just really hateful, just ugly behavior that I did not agree with, and that, even if you and I share some philosophical ideas, I'm not okay with you being socially ugly to people that we may disagree with.
That's a big pet peeve of mine a lot in life. Partially because I am very much a live and let live sort of person, and I try to listen. If someone to not be too judgmental based on it's something we all know. Don't judge a book by its cover. And when I see people doing that, it is one of the biggest turnoffs to their organization or whatever, that I can't look past that a lot of times, because I don't think that's a path forward in any way. That when you see that kind of bias right off the bat, like, have your feeling, everyone's going to feel different beliefs, different whatever, but if you can't listen to what else somebody else is saying without prejudging them, there's no way forward.
Yeah. Well, and if you have points of disagreement with people, there are real, useful, actual points of disagreement. But I don't think that you make progress on those by just shouting at people and being pejorative and being
if you can
antisocial in your behavior.
You need to be able to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Or you're not actually trying to affect change. You're just being a brute and trying to force your way. I mean, you have to, like, that's a society. That is the culture. I mean, that's what we live in, right?
Yeah.
This is not, we don't live under a king. We vote and we have different ideas and we try to, live in the same place peacefully, knowing that we all have different ideas. And it seems like there's a push against that now. Like, it's surprising that people think differently.
Yeah. So I think another thing that I wanted with the podcast was, and I think a number of podcasts are like this, is that with social media and with maybe some of the things that you're kind of alluding to, I think that there's a number of places on the internet where you can get involved. You can get embroiled in controversy. You can get involved in arguments and that kind of stuff, and you can negativity, that sort of thing. But I'd like for there to be a venue for, like I say, I keep repeating the phrase, interesting conversations. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a place for that, and I think people want to be involved in that. Right. So, and that's one thing that I see happening in podcasts, is that people enjoy that as a resource to go to. I know that I do. And instead of going and finding some inflammatory video or some argument on an internet thread, how about an interesting conversation where people are not shouting at each other, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. You can just look at topics that you're interested in. And you can find debates even, but a lot of them are very civil, and it's just people that want to on both sides want to be involved because they're just trying to actually just get at the truth of the matter. Yeah. And so that it's a very valuable thing. That's how we grow, is through testing our methods, and where are we failing? Mm-hmm.
So in my thinking about what are some categories that bring these things together, these conversations that I think are interesting and that kind of act as umbrellas for some of these values that I share and that help make sense or make meaning in life. I came up with 4 broad archetypes through which we pursue meaning. Okay? And those are the phrases that I'm going to use for them are warrior, poet, hero, and sage. And so I have some definitions, the way that I'm going to define them, and then we'll flesh them out a little bit. And when we bring guests on, we'll talk with them kind of. They'll fall under those categories, maybe fall under one more strongly than another, but also each of those categories interpenetrate one another and interweave with one another in their meanings. So maybe to start with warrior, right? And talk a little bit about what I mean by the warrior archetype. So warrior, a number of people that are in kind of my friends circle resonate with that phrase right away, with that word right away. And then some people are kind of turned off by that word or think that the word has just a narrow application, shouldn't be applied to people broadly. So I have a way of defining this archetype that I think can be applied broadly. And I also think with each of these, I picture it kind of like maybe a ladder or a pyramid. And you can picture there can be people who reside at the pinnacle of the pyramid who, more fully embody the traits of that archetype and maybe serve as an aspirational figure to look to inspire those of us who think that this is an admirable thing to be or an admirable trait to pursue. But to get down to kind of what I mean by warrior, this is the basic idea. The basic idea is that hardship, that suffering, that discomfort is not always a bad thing, and that we can meet with hardships and discomfort and suffering and use it as a potential opportunity for growth. Okay. And here's why I think that's so important. Basically, those things that I just listed, we could start like at the lower end: irritations, discomforts, inconveniences, and then turn up the dial: pain and suffering. So those are all within the same family. Those are a fact of life. They're everywhere. Mm-hmm. We're always going to have to deal with them. Okay. And I think that we can take a couple of different stances towards that fact. We can see that as, well, I have to avoid those things at all costs. Mm-hmm. Okay, so every time that there's an inconvenience or a discomfort in my life, I have to avoid that. I have to get away from it. Right? That's my stance or my orientation in life is get away from inconvenience or suffering of any kind.
Mm-hmm. It's like when I forget to turn on the coffee pot the night before, and I suffer in that morning when I get up and it's not made.
There you go.
You know,
that's I don't know if that's suffering or discomfort or inconvenience.
It's deep suffering.
Deep suffering.
Deep suffering.
So yeah, one stance that we can have is that's to be avoided at all costs, right? Another stance that we can have that I think is a better stance to take is that we have opportunities when we encounter those inconveniences, those discomforts, even those pains, those sufferings, those instances of suffering. We have an opportunity in those moments for growth or for learning. Mm-hmm. And I think that attitude, I'm characterizing that attitude, that disposition as a warrior-esque approach, one of the defining traits of a warrior-esque approach. Sense.
Okay. So what you're saying is it's like it's the denial of the pleasure now.
Yeah, well, pleasure at all costs. Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For the betterment of whatever it is that you're striving for.
Yeah, and
as opposed to looking at the comfort, the extreme level of comfort, or whatever. Your comfort level is all about right now.
Yeah, so that actually kind of makes me. So you mentioned pleasure. Here's what I think that that's actually a. I don't know if illusion is the right word. It is a misunderstanding to think that we can always have pleasure right now.
Right.
Okay. And
chasing the dragon, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always going to be finite. And so you're always going to have to deal with what is your baseline. Can you deal with your baseline, whatever that is, or
right.
do you always need to add a layer of pleasure, and then you can't? But it's not. You can't sustain that though. That's the ultimate problem.
Right. Yeah. So here's the way that I put that. Whatever you are experiencing, you are experiencing in contrast to your immediately preceding state. So whatever you're experiencing right now, you're experiencing in contrast to the state that you were just
That's
experiencing
what makes it
immediately
a relative
prior.
experience. I mean,
That's right.
I mean, that's why one person can say something's good, someone else can say something's good, and they're totally different things.
Yeah. So that's why if you come in from a long day out in the cold and wet, working on a construction site or hunting or hiking in the woods, or just out in the cold and wet for who knows why.
For fun of it.
Yeah. When you get
Had some days like that.
when you get cold and wet, there is almost nothing in the world that feels better than going from being cold and wet to getting warm and dry.
Yeah.
Right? It's very simple.
Right.
It's a very simple pleasure, but it feels really, really good. Once you've gotten warm and dry, like
It's no big deal to be warm and dry.
yeah, if you take a hot shower and come out and put on some nice warm sweats and warm slippers, and then somebody says, "Hey, you want another hot shower?"
Giant discomfort.
Yeah.
You're good.
Because you have no contrast.
Right. You have to have the spectrum, and we've talked about this before too. The value of a spectrum of experience on different levels, and we're talking about discomfort and growth and things. That's one reason to test yourself in different ways, and hopefully when you're younger as well, because you can then see that a lot of things that you may have complained about, you may not complain about anymore, because you just realize it's not that as big a deal, because you put it in perspective, which you didn't have before.
Right. Yep. For sure. So, and I think that we can maybe spend a little more time on that at some point in the future, but to kind of reel back to talking about the different perspectives with approaching suffering. So we said you can either see it as I've got to avoid this at all costs, or you can see it as a lot of times I can embrace this, right, as an opportunity for growth. And here's one of the biggest reasons why I think that this is such a valuable mindset to nurture and to grow in yourself. Okay, why I think it's such an empowering mindset. It's the ubiquity of discomforts, sufferings, excuse me, inconveniences. Okay, and so here's a real easy illustration for just how universal these things are going to be. The fact that you and I are talking about them. Right? If you and I can recognize that life is full of this stuff, then it has to be unavoidable. And what do I mean by that? Well, here we are in the 21st century in a first world country. Right?
If we can't avoid discomfort,
nobody can.
Nobody can. And so clearly that's not how we should measure our lives in any way.
Yeah. So this we have it better than people who were royalty a couple of centuries ago. We have higher standard of living than those people did, and we still see all the time things that bother us or irritate us.
I've thought about this, and I've thought about it's actually, I think, amazing. I think a lot of it, in my estimation, not having looked into it super deeply, is the adaptability of humans.
Yeah, is
great. I mean, it's a superpower almost, but it also breeds boredom and contempt for things, because you're just like,
you can adapt the other way.
For sure. Yeah. I've said the same. I mean, I don't own a helicopter, but I can imagine someday when I do, that a couple months after having a helicopter, you just have a helicopter just like you have a car or you have something else. It's not like it's not cool and you won't use it or whatever, but it doesn't feel like it feels like it would feel right now.
No. You can get bored with a Ferrari.
I think about right now, if I don't have it, oh man. But it's not, I know just from experience with other things that it will not feel that exciting to have a helicopter after having a helicopter for 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
I mean, it at least not as much as I think that it will now.
Right.
Based on all my experience of anything new that I've gotten.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll talk more detail on, I have like a list of master traits that I think fit under the warrior heading. And this should not come as a surprise to you, but I'll have a lot of stuff where I think jiu-jitsu and MMA training fit and inform the development of those traits. Okay, so the development of psychological grit, the development of the ability to deal with fatigue, the development of the everything that has to do with self-possession and emotional control under duress and all those kinds of things. Those are all having to do with getting better and better at dealing with discomfort and pursuing a goal or using that for your own personal edification or growth in the face of discomfort.
Isn't it? Would you say use the word self-mastery at all?
Yeah, something like that.
Because just something I've been thinking about a lot is that we know typically actually the right answer. It's not that we don't know the right answer a lot of times with a lot of things in our lives. It's the implementation of them.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is like, so it's not do we know what to do? It's like, how do we get ourselves under control enough to be our own masters?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, to make the body do what the mind knows it should do.
Yeah. Discipline, self-control, self-possession, all of those words are kind of talking around the same idea.
The point is my point is how simple of a concept that is and how hard it is.
Yeah, that's where the phrase "simple, not easy" comes from. It's simple, it's not easy.
Like people hear something like that and they're like, "Yeah, of course," but how many of us do it?
Well, that's another one of that's another one of the warrior lessons, you know, and that actually maybe kind of leads me to another of the broad themes that I will revisit under the warrior headings, and that is, I'm going to consistently advise, suggest that people be involved in that we on this project to better ourselves, to enliven the warrior archetype, to pursue, to aspire to these types of traits down this path.
So some more training seminars.
That we be involved in a bodily pursuit as well as just
absolutely
being involved in mental wrestling, right?
Absolutely.
So there's a difference in just talking about these ideas, writing them down, reading books about them, putting them on a whiteboard, looking at PowerPoints about them. Sure. That's
warrior poet, right? I mean, that's the difference. Like the poet is thinking about how things are going, and the warrior's out there physically doing the things, and you need both of those elements to be.
You have to
complete,
engage the body.
Really,
you have to engage the body, and that's part of that discipline and self-mastery. You know, is you've got to get your entire body involved in it for a number of different reasons. You know, you're not going to get all of the physical responses. You know, but your brain is a part of your body, right? So, I mean, your hormonal responses and all of the things that are tied to that, your emotions are tied to the emotional, your emotions are tied to the hormonal soup that's going on, the electrical soup that's going on in your brain, right? So, training and having some sort of bodily exercise, some sort of psychological battle and physical battle is highly instructive on this path. So I'm definitely going to spend time talking about that and giving specific examples of that, because without that, you're definitely going to truncate progress. So that's an introduction to the idea of warrior, and we'll have a number of guests a lot of guest ideas that we have to bring on are in that category. But they touch on other categories as well, as we're going to see, because none of these archetypes stand on their own. None of the definitions are just out there on their own. So, poet. The idea of the poet has to do with the Platonic ideals of the good, the beautiful, and the true. With the individual, it has to do with the path toward trying to find your position or orientation toward those ideals, right? And that is a lifelong path. It's an arduous path, and so since I just used that word, we're back to talking about kind of enlivening the warrior part of you, right? So poetry is not just about art and beauty and leisure, right? There's a work part to that, right? You're
not going to get to the fancy words if you haven't experienced some life, because you won't be able to put them together.
Yeah, for sure. Or maybe another way to think of it is so a jujitsu quote that I really like, and I won't get it just right, but it's from a guy who's a black belt under Matt Thornton, Straight Blast Gym. Now he runs. His name's Luis Gutierrez, and now he runs a company called ISR Matrix, which is they train law enforcement and military guys.
Yeah.
But back in the day on the SBG forums, I remember him saying, for every beautiful sweep that you pull off in jiu-jitsu, you earn that sweep, or you earn the beauty of that sweep by cooking under cross-side pressure for a couple of hours. That may not have been exactly the way he said it. Lewis says things really well. He said something like that, right? So here's the idea. For any listeners that don't know exactly some of those terms, a sweep in jiu-jitsu is where you intercept someone's body weight and flip them over, right? So you were on the bottom position, which is disadvantageous, and you reverse that position, and a lot of times it is just beautiful. When it's executed well, it's beautiful, and it looks effortless. And in fact, if your timing's just right, it feels pretty effortless, because you've put leverage to work, you've put timing to work, and you've reversed the position with very little effort, and it looks beautiful. It is beautiful. Okay, it's beautiful.
All you have to do is step 1, hold the arm. Step 2, hook the foot.
Yeah, it's a beautiful application of mechanics. Yeah, and all you have to do is this. All you have to do is get everything just right. However, Lewis's point was this: that the ability to do that is not free. Okay, because in jiu-jitsu, nothing's free. Nobody just gives you stuff, because it's not a demonstration. Right? You're actually rolling against resistance. You're actually wrestling against resistance. So the other term that he's using, the cross-sides pressure, that he said that you have to cook under, what that means is somebody pinning you down to the ground. So you have to pay with suffering. You have to pay with discomfort to get good enough to have that beautiful application. All right? So the warrior poet thing gets together, similar to what you were saying. Like so anyone who wants to be a good writer, writing doesn't just pop out, right? I'm sure if you want to be a good artist, be able to draw or paint, it takes a lot of work. I'm not any good at either of those, so I don't know that from personal experience, but I know the people who do. My wife's a very good painter.
Those beautiful paintings don't come from just the first time you pick up a paintbrush.
Right. Absolutely.
And for me, doing with music stuff, I spent 8 hours a day sometimes. Sounded terrible, just knowing it too. So like hours and hours and hours of doing that, to once in a while be performing music where it's like, oh, I got that.
Yeah.
And it's not even, I mean, you get better as you go, but the when it all comes together, the amount of work that has come behind that one moment makes it so satisfying. But it's so rewarding because it's of the work that it took to get there as well, because you knew that is just not coming out of the box the first day you know, sit down and practice your instrument.
Yeah. And that might be, you know, so we're talking right now about the beautiful, so I'm going to keep in mind good, beautiful, true. And so we're speaking of, and I said at the beginning, the way that I picture this is, for the poet archetype, is on your personal path, trying to find your voice in speaking about or speaking to the good, the beautiful, and the true. Okay. And from a musician standpoint, you know, finding your own way to express beauty is different from just, for example, learning the riffs, right? Or if you were learning the bass or the piano, the scales.
Sure.
Right? And that would be similar in jiu-jitsu to developing your game or your style. It's not a simple thing. I'm sure it's very similar if you're painting or whatever. You have to get the fundamental understanding.
Right.
That takes years of work, years of dedication.
And then at some time you have to break away from, once you understand the concepts deeply enough, you have to allow your own creativity in. That's
what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that. I've already got at least a couple jiu-jitsu guys that I want to talk to about that. I know we know some musicians that we're going to get on that we talk with about that. And so the development of your voice, your style, and how that plays into that. And then how that also relates to the warrior idea of work and discomfort and seeing that as a good thing, you know, not avoiding it, and how you can mix those two lessons together. Right? So, and that would relate too. So we just talked about beauty, but the good, how do you find what is good? How do you define that? That takes work. How do you find what is true? And that takes work and consistent work. Each of those take consistent work, defining them in your life, then pursuing them. That takes growth and continual reassessment. And those are not easy or automatic processes either, right? So those are also going to enliven the warrior part of you, because you're going to have to recognize that growth and discomfort go hand in hand a lot of times. Right? So there's a lot of stuff that we're going to get to pursue in there. We'll bring on jiu-jitsu people, MMA people, philosophy people, economics people, musicians, artists. Just interesting folks.
This is a good combo.
Military types, all sorts.
Jesters, court jesters.
Yep. Something like that. Whatever we can find. And I think we'll do another segment for hero and sage. As like I said, everybody kind of has their thoughts whenever you say each of those words. But have
I keep thinking
specific
about
thoughts.
hippies when you say sage.
Really? No. Think wisdom.
Really,
think wisdom. Not sage the plant.
We really need to sage the space shuttle. I mean,
no. I better hurry up and get that definition down.
I literally did hear that there was some ladies thought there was a ghost in here.
Well,
that true story. I promise you, I heard that yesterday. So anyway,
I'm not worried about
just
that
in
at
case. You see someone over the corner and be like, oh, there's a ghost.
I
I knew that Eric said that somebody said there might be a ghost in here.
Haven't I slept up here at night before?
Yeah. I'm just not, you know what? I'm not a kid, so I don't remember. Maybe I was. But to me, I kind of think, well, what did a ghost ever do?
I don't know. I
That's one of those things you can literally hide under your covers to get away from.
No, I remember having that thought when I was a kid, and I would go out in the dark in our house, and I would, whenever I would feel like something was sneaking up behind me, I would literally sit there and I would be scared. I would be so scared. But then I would think to myself, okay, what are you going to do? You're going to touch me?
Yeah.
And then I would think to myself, okay, just dare the thing to touch me.
Yeah.
Then. Because that's all I've ever I mean, what do they do?
That's the same sort of questioning I went through. I was like, at some point I was like, well, then what?
Yeah, because all that they are ever shown to do is jump out, and then people freak out. Right. And I was like, so what if you don't freak out? What do they do? Do they just go, whoa, and you go, okay?
So I went.
So now what are you going to do? You're going to just touch me?
Yeah, exactly.
You look like a sheet. So
and
what?
And then what?
And so I would just sit there in the dark and purposely kind of thrill myself, but also kind of be like, fuck you.
Yeah, this is dumb. At some point you start.
So touch my shoulder then.
I'm just going to close my eyes.
Yeah.
And go to sleep because you literally have zero power once I close my eyes. Right. So. Fuck you, ghost.
Yeah. All right, man. Let's cut on that one. We got 41 minutes.